Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome my guest, Tucker Perkins. He is the CEO of the Propane Education Research Council. Tucker, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thanks, Robert. I'm looking forward to being with you today.
Well, I hope not to disappoint. So let's jump right in. I told you just before we started recording that I'm interested in propane. I'm interested in fuel diversity. But I didn't warn you that I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. I've told you, I've told the guests who you are, but give us assume you've arrived at a dinner party or a function and you don't know anyone there and you have 30 or 45 seconds to introduce yourself. What would you say?
Well, I think the official start is I am the president and CEO of this Propane Education and Research Council, which is based in Washington. I'd never consider myself a Washingtonian at all. I live in Virginia, and really I've spent my life in the energy industry around construction and innovations and venture capital work, really seeing that primarily natural gas and propane are being used safely and wisely, and that we continue this innovation. So it's been a great career to be a part of the energy industry and really labor specifically now around how propane is used.
And what is propane?
Well, so many people say, well, I don't know much about propane other than my gas grill. 50 million homes have a gas grill. Maybe during this pandemic, people have realized it's a fuel that powers their patio heater and really changed their lives. But it's so much more than that. UPS runs propane powered vehicles. Most everyone knows about propane is heat or home hot water, cooking, fireplaces. But we're so much more than that.
Well, but the molecule itself, I looked it up, C3H8.
Yeah.
Natural gas is CH4. This is what I looked it up. It's called a simple alkane. So this is produced. It's a natural gas liquid. That's the other.
And I think that's what's so important, right? You could argue that it's a waste product from refining natural gas. We used to say it's either one of the lighter things in a crude well or one of the heavier things in a gas well. But, with the shale evolution, really what it's become is a primary resource for America. We're the largest producer of propane in the world by far. We're also the largest consumer of propane in the world by far. But really, I like to say propane becomes almost a portable natural gas. But we don't have natural gas's little problem about methane being so reactive as a greenhouse gas. So we're an energy dense, we're a little bit more powerful, if you will, than natural gas. We are
in terms of energy density, so that if you put it in a container, you're going to get more energy, more heat energy out of that
right
canister of propane than you would a canister of equal size canister of natural gas.
Exactly. And it's easy to transport. That's why
because of the chemical structure.
Right. That's why you see it in, for your grill. It's so easy to put it into a simple steel canister, store it, use it. It's really an amazing, versatile energy tool. And, for you people in Texas, we began to talk about now how easy it is for storage. I mean, as we think about electricity and everybody talks about storage, thinking about batteries, it's one of the benefits of propane, right? You can store however much you need until your supplier refills you. So in a lot of ways, that has new relevance as we think about resilience and needing propane when you didn't quite think about how much you needed.
Well, I like that idea because that clearly has become a big focal point in the wake of the blackouts here in Texas. And it would be one thing if we just had blackouts in Texas, but we had a few months ago, we had blackouts in California. So this idea of resilience and reliability really, I think, should be key to a lot of the energy discussions now. And one of the things that attracted me to the pitch that some of your advocates hit me with was that you have been talking about something called the 3D grid. And I'm going to steal this idea. I'm going to warn you because I like the idea of it, but explain what you mean by that. Because I think that when we talk about the grid, we generally only think about the electricity grid.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, in fact,
more than that.
As an engineer, a scientist, a person that's been involved in all of this for so long, it's always strikes me as how most people tend to think about just energy coming from overhead power lines. And so we do talk about a three-dimensional energy grid because I think it's a great way to call attention to, in fact, each of those three dimensions. yes, electricity is a part of our life, will always be a part of our life, right? It's what powers our TVs and our cell phones and everything else. And it's delivered to us in generally power lines that are in the air overhead, an important part of our life. And by the way, I don't think power lines are going to ever be anything but generally overhead and in the air. What we don't often think about, because it's out of sight and out of mind, is this vast network of natural gas or underground pipelines that were put in long ago when energy security was a real concern, generally around military action. I mean, World War II, we saw that development of pipelines. Those pipelines have been bought and paid for. They're out of sight, out of mind, and they bring us vital products. Sometimes gasoline, sometimes diesel, certainly jet fuel to power our aircraft, and then natural gas. And, you know, it's always an amazing statistic to me if you think about it, but a user of natural gas connects that vast pipeline that's generally in Texas. Now we have the Marcellus, so it's all over the world. And when they turn on their stove or their furnace, that connects a pipeline from where gas was found all the way to where you're using it. So there's this vast network of underground pipelines. What people often fail to think about, though, is what I tend to call the vital center. You Texans all of a sudden thought about the vital center. Your overhead power lines weren't really available. Your underground network of natural gas systems were very strained at the moment. And in fact, trying to provide gas to places that don't normally need quite so much gas. It was that vital center, in my case, the propane fuel and the industry that delivers it, that became so relevant.
And so, and if I can interrupt there, because so that's the surface grid. So the overhead
correct.
grid, the
not overhead,
grid, the underground grid, and the surface grid. And that surface
correct.
grid, you're talking about the physical tanks that are sitting on the ground that are storing propane, but there are also physical tanks that, as I've thought about this since we, before we started recording, there are a lot of gasoline, oil that's stored on the surface as well in big tanks.
And that's certainly a part of that vital middle as well. Again, the other thing that we don't often talk about is natural gas is clearly a just-in-time delivery system, right? You're beholden to the pipe. Quite the same for overhead wires, right? They can only deliver a finite amount for a use at a certain time, and both of them are vulnerable to an interruption. Did ice take away the overhead power? Did a construction incident take away the underground system? That vital middle allows storage. You can have, sometimes if you have a grill, you just have 4 gallons stored at your house. If you have an industrial facility, you might have 1 million gallons of propane stored for your needs. So you can choose your storage, and then we're able to refill and resupply, and in fact, bring in resources to areas. As you see in Texas, we can apply additional resources where the necessary need is. So that wasn't our first time in Texas. Certainly in your storms of, various hurricanes, various floods you've had, sure, we've seen that response where the vital middle really is the difference between having energy or not. I mean, think about all the cooking teams.
That's just it's a great point. And yeah, I think that it's one of the issues that is being lost in a lot of the discussions now around climate change. But when looking at briefly, and just so I'm remind everybody, I'm talking to Tucker Perkins. He's the CEO of the Propane Education Research Council. You can find him on propane.com and more about propane there. But that resilience and reliability issue of having something that you can see and you can store on site, because that's one of the issues that's really come to the fore in terms of generation in the state of Texas, and the argument that, well, we need to have fuel on site at those generation plants. And one of the things I saw before we started recording on propane.com is propane fired generators, which I hadn't really thought about before. Are those becoming more popular? I didn't even know how common are they?
Well, let's even talk about one thing for you in Texas. What is the one thing that you didn't lose through Winter Storm Uri? And that was your cell phone, right? Generally, cell towers work. Why? Because almost every cell tower is backed up by a generator, and in most cases, a propane generator.
Oh, really? So they're not storing diesel. They're not storing diesel in those generators. It's generally propane.
Yeah, generally, because propane has been such a clean fuel to use, so easy to store. And so whether you use it or not, there's no degradation of the fuel. Lots of reasons that people would prefer a propane generator over a diesel or gasoline generator. So, but one of the things you see in many homeowners across the country, I mean, my neighborhood particularly, I probably see, I don't know, 60 or 70% of the homes in my neighborhood are backed up with a propane powered generator. I live in a place where the power's not been that reliable, and so they've made the investment. So certainly propane generators for backup, but I know you love to talk about innovation. It's probably my favorite thing to talk about. We are moving to this world where decentralized power is not something we just talk about, it's something we do. And one of the innovations that I've been involved with for the last 5 to 10 years is continuing to see that we have more and more robust engines to provide better power, prime power, to places where it's really needed.
So those engines would be reciprocating engines like a V8 or a V6 or like you'd find in your car. That's the engine you're talking about.
Yes, I mean, just so certainly internal combustion engines, but highly efficient, highly durable. That's kind of the new modern things. And also from an environmental perspective, because we don't do anything anymore without an eye towards how does this impact the climate and your health. These engines are also very clean.
And so these would be the ones found inside a Generac unit or one of the other brand name generators.
Absolutely. Generac's a great partner of ours. Kohler is a great partner, Briggs and Stratton. Yes, exactly. Those type engines.
So how big, I'm from Oklahoma. I grew up in Tulsa. I knew about the natural gas liquids business growing up, of course, butane, propane, ethane, xylene. They're
you got it. You're good for you with your organic chemistry chain.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I'm not going to brag on my chemistry, especially my father-in-law is a PhD chemist at the University of Michigan or has an emeritus there. But tell me about one of the things that I think about propane as well is that it's not something you see except in urban areas. You see it in grills and patio heaters, but I think of it as more of a fuel for rural America. So
absolutely,
how many homes in America have propane tanks?
Well, I think it's always a myth. As I said, 50 million homes have a gas grill. Over 5 million homes have propane in them for their primary heat. Cooking, 1 million farms have propane on the farm to use it. So clearly,
and they're using it there for water heating, space heating, and cooking are the main.
Well, in a farm, they're using it for certainly to take care of their own needs for cooking, hot water, heating. But on the farm itself, all of the animals perhaps need the heat. Grain drying, dairies are huge consumers of propane for hot water needs. All of the grain drying, and then we're beginning to see now a lot of use of propane to power the agricultural equipment. Again, we're kind of moving in this world where diesel and gasoline are beginning to have truly competitive alternatives, and propane is probably the next step. Easy to transport, easy to store, burns so much cleaner. I mean, it's amazing to me, but if you compare a diesel engine to a propane engine, a lot of our engines will be 96% cleaner in NOx emissions. NOx emissions, we don't ever talk about it as a society, right? We talk about greenhouse gases and CO2, and we talk about climate. I'm equally concerned with climate and health, and it's NOx emissions and particulate matter that really matter to our health, our children's health, plant health. And
those are criteria pollutants and under EPA rules, and we've had, well, frankly, over the last few decades, great success in reducing NOx from particularly from automobiles. But you're saying that propane in automobiles, forklifts are another common application, aren't they?
One of the reasons that they are a common application is they're so much cheaper, more powerful, more durable, and then cleaner. That's really how we got to these. I mean, I don't know, your listeners probably don't realize it, but this morning, 22,000 school buses taking children to school. We took 1.2 million children to school this morning in propane powered school buses. Why? It's because they're so much cleaner, healthier, quieter, and then cheaper to operate. So, there's as you correctly say, I think most people don't have any realization what propane is doing beyond their grill. And yet here we are, really the center of energy beyond the natural gas main. Whether it's a farm, a home, an industrial business, or certainly the 5 million homes that we have today beyond the means.
So about how big is the market? I know that the U.S. is now, because of the shale revolution, is exporting a lot of propane. How big is the domestic in terms of dollars? Do you know this number? How big the domestic?
Yeah, well,
propane
I
business
usually think
is?
of it in terms of gallons. Kind of put it in perspective. The U.S. industry consumes about 10 billion gallons a year. We also export about 12 or 14 billion gallons a year. So interestingly, we export more than we consume domestically. We are the Saudi Arabia of propane. We have the world's largest supply in Texas. You have the world's largest export facility there in Mont Belvieu. And so it is this vital resource, and we really labor to see that it's used in the U.S. safely. But we also begin to change the dialogue around how propane and natural gas can be used for the environmental good, right? One of the things that, again, the common logic out there is that there's a narrow path to decarbonization, right? The path to decarbonization is electrification. And that couldn't really be further from the truth. You've learned it the hard way around resilience, right? If I had one path and you take that path away, I'm cold, I can't cook, I can't eat, I don't have a hot shower. But it's even a little sadder. In today, propane is cleaner than electricity right now in 37, 38 of the 50 states, right?
And
the
how,
grid.
how do you mean that it's cleaner? What do you mean by that?
Well, and I'm talking about specifically to greenhouse gases and CO2. And that statement, I'm glad to see that it shocks you, because it's the grid today. People just make the distinction that this path to decarbonization is through electrification. They don't ever talk about what the grid looks like today, right? I travel to places where the grid is 70, 75% today from coal. So it strikes me.
That'd be states like Wyoming, West Virginia, Kentucky, some states where the electricity is primarily coming from coal. You just
hit the three big, and it still shocks me, right? In all three of those states, their use of coal is 70% or more. Is that grid cleaner? Is electrifying in those states going to improve the environment? No. So today,
so when you say the 37 or 38 states, you're looking at the electricity mix and the fuels that are creating that electricity, and you're comparing that to burning the propane directly in the home versus converting it into electricity. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Good.
So one of the things we do,
so I can because I want to jump back to this idea, the scale of the market, because I don't know these numbers.
Yeah. Well, let me give you a direct answer.
Sure.
So it's about the same in the US as it is in the world. So we're about 4% of the US energy portfolio, right? So if you just take all of the BTUs consumed in this country, we're about 4% of those. And worldwide, propane, or LPG as it may be known worldwide, even though it has vastly different uses, right? In Africa, we're really replacing the use of wood and dung as a cooking fuel and saving hundreds of thousands of lives from indoor air pollution. But worldwide, we're about 4% of the energy mix. Here's the statistic, though, that's more important to me. We touch about 60% of the population, right? So even though we're a relatively
propane in the U.S. is ultimately used by 60% of Americans.
That's true. Yes.
And that's an amazing. So that's statistic. Either in their grill or in their patio heater or in their water heater in their home if they're living in a rural area or something like that.
Yes. So we have never, and I think it really plays to our advantage as we think about the future of energy, in that we've always been this niche player, right? We're not behemoth utilities with monopoly, service territories. We've been independent businesses that had to vie for our own business. So we're used to working with other fuels, other companies, and we're used to being a player. And I think that's playing to our advantage, as yes, we're embracing working with solar and working with wind, changing our own fuel. But I think we're on the beginning where this portable, versatile fuel that's also very clean for the climate, good for our health, and then we haven't gotten to the other important part. You're able to afford it, right? So now we mix all of that together, and we're really seeing a real renaissance of the use of propane in a lot of new applications.
And give me an example of that.
Well, I'll just talk about one. School buses is
Oh,
one.
right.
Right?
Okay. Right.
Today we're powering
generators.
21,000.
I guess standby generators would be one.
Vehicle transportation, standby generators, but quickly moving to prime power generators, right? I travel now and see hospitals, nursing homes, beyond the grid, prisons that previously would not have thought about using propane, but because they need to have massive amounts of hot water, cooking, clothes drying, heat, they're choosing propane. For their
they're
fuel.
not close to the gas grid, and that's not enough.
Right. Natural gas wasn't available to them.
Connect.
And electricity is an inferior choice either for cost or for the amount they need. I mean, and the truth is propane does a few jobs really well. We heat water really well. We provide all those outdoor appliances like grills and patio heaters and torches. We do that really well, right? We heat your house when it's cold really well. And in every one of those instances, I think we do it better than even electricity.
Well, I want to follow on that affordability because I published a piece just a few days ago, in fact, on this issue because the Department of Energy published data on comparing different residential fuels on a per MMBTU basis, and one of them was propane, natural gas, electricity, number two, heating oil, and kerosene. And natural gas was a quarter of the cost of electricity, and propane on a per BTU basis, and propane was half the cost. So that speaks to your affordability issue, right?
Exactly. And I think one of the things, again, that strikes me as I kind of speak on this issue around the country, and to a degree speak on it around the world, is everyone wants to talk about equity and justice and affordability. And I never really know what that means to everyone, because to me, it means, one, there's a vast amount of investment that has to be made. Sometimes it's a federal investment. Sometimes it's private investment. And then a consumer has to be able to pay for the choices that they're given. One of the beauties of propane, you've already said it, it's generally regarded as this fuel of rural America, the fuel that's, not in the cities. So maybe per capita income is reduced. We have been the fuel of rural America. We're also a fuel that's affordable. So when the conversation gets around to equity and justice, I think we're the fuel that probably rises to the top. As you correctly said, Energy Information Administration kind of proved it out in that data they just showed that it's cheaper than electricity. But I would say it's even a little bit more than that. If you look forward and skate forward a decade or 2 decades, it's going to continue to be cheaper. And the last piece of that, I'm not political, don't ever intend to be, but we're talking now about the investment needed to make the grid smarter, to be able to mix intermittent fuels like wind and solar with baseload power like natural gas or coal or nuclear. And the investment to do that, I mean, I see numbers all over the map, but my personal belief is that investment is something well north of $10 trillion for sure. Who makes that $10 trillion investment? Is it part government, part industry? Who pays for that? Whoever makes the investment, right? Do ratepayers pay for it?
About 10 trillion would be to decarbonize the U.S. economy. Is that what you're talking about overall?
No, I think it really is to get the grid to the spot where the grid could actually be this cleaner, resilient, and smart grid that is able to mix baseload power with intermittent power. I mean, that's a massive step that no one ever really fully bakes. And as a person who really not only is involved in this, but I'm involved in it with my pocketbook, right? We make investments in these technologies that we want to see they have a shelf life of 10, 20, 30 years. So we're thinking a lot about what does the grid look like? What does our energy delivery system look like 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades from now? And the investment needed is massive. And that all figures back to this conversation about equity and justice, right? Why? I mean, it's today, it's the current conversation, right? Well, who can afford a Tesla? Well, the tend to be the coastal elites, a word I don't use very much. Those people who are best able to afford a Tesla. As we think about this grid evolving, we still have to think about who can pay for the energy they need to use. And I think propane has a vital role in that as we really kind of maintain, if you will, a very low cost product.
So you've given me the numbers on, you said 10 billion gallons a year. In the US, consumption of propane is 10 billion gallons a year.
Yeah, they're retail consumption. So farms, homes, businesses, that has nothing to do with chemical demand or petrochemicals or any of that. And then we export about 15 billion gallons.
Okay.
As well.
So, but in terms of the overall value of the propane industry in the US, how many billions of dollars would this be? Do you have
Well, I think you could say in round numbers, it's about a $20 billion industry right now for just that, what I would call retail propane.
I see. Okay. So, and the chemical part of this is a whole other discussion in terms of how LPG broadly and propane specifically is used in chemical production. So I'm assuming it's used in for splitting into urethane, other kinds of chemicals. What is propane's value in chemical?
Actually, propane can be one of the first chemicals for plastics and that whole polyethylene chain. So there's a huge chemical use for propane, but propane is just one of those things that can be used, right? Sometimes it's about ethane, ethylene, propane, propylene, so we go into the chemical world, and really one of the things that always helps us is it's that chemical usage that balances out this big production network, which part of it goes to us as homeowners and farms and businesses, part of it goes to our own commercial chemical demand, and then part of it's exported. And it's a neat system. And again, because propane is so easily stored in caverns underground in Mont Belvieu, Texas, stored in tanks, stored in ships, stored at Dow chemical facilities around the world, that storage can also be easily done. And so there's this vast network,
and it's a stable molecule, so it doesn't degrade then over time. Gasoline and diesel fuel, that's always a concern. If you store it too long, it's going to degrade. But you're saying propane doesn't.
That's one of the reasons we talk a lot about it in standby generators, in that you can put a tank at your house, not use it for a decade, not use it for 3 decades, and when you want to use it, it's there. I mean, I run a gasoline powered lawnmower. I run a propane weed eater and a propane lawnmower. And I do it because I never have to have any concerns at all about that fuel gumming up. I actually run a propane outboard motor, and I might turn it on 2 times a year, but when I turn it on, it fires up immediately. And
you don't have to worry about ethanol. You don't have to worry about the ethanol eating the seals in the gasoline from the gasoline. That's
no concerns whatsoever.
I haven't heard of propane outboard motors. I haven't heard of a propane weed eater either.
Well, and you wouldn't. I mean, those are niche products, but sure. Again, 25,000 commercial mowers are out in the world today cutting grass using propane. And by the way, one of the things is we always go to health. One of the things that always strikes me is we're in golf courses and we're cutting grass. When I visit with those people, they always say, well, this fuel is cheaper, it's more powerful, and it's quieter. That's a universal. But the other thing they tell me is, when I got on this propane lawnmower, I quit having headaches, or my sinuses behaved better. I mean, there's this, we saw it right with the pandemic. We saw when we stopped driving, the skies cleared, and the sunshine was a little bit brighter perhaps. And that's really that smog impact that you see in cities. And using propane for even vehicles or for mobile applications like mowing and forklifts, that's why we use it. It's not only more powerful and easy to store, it's healthier for the operator.
Sure. So I have to tell you, we've been doing this. My colleague Tyson Culver's producing the podcast, and we've been doing this now. We're going to be on a year, I guess, in June. I believe you're the first association president that we've had, or association CEO that we've had on. And it's interesting to me that we're talking about propane because, but you're a very convincing evangelist for propane. But let me ask you about, you said we use about 10 billion gallons in the retail sector, and you said it's about a $10 billion business, so $1 a gallon. But when I buy propane, or when as I understand it, you pay for it by the pound. Why is that? But it's sold by the pound, which is
So to be fair, I said we're about a 10 billion gallon industry, and we're about a $20 billion industry. So
Oh,
I
okay.
said about $2, but you are correct. When you buy it in a 20-pound cylinder, you're generally buying it by the pound. So if you're buying it for your grill, you're buying it by the pound.
Well,
But
why is that?
well, the reason is really small. I mean, a lot of people buy it in 1 pound increments for their camping use or whatever, right? So there, it's always, so the answer is we can sell it to you in as a smaller denomination, or frankly, as in large a denomination as you need, right? We used to run an export business, and there we would sell it in 10 million gallon quantities. So, but yeah, I mean, look, there's a huge business nationwide for it in 1 pound cylinders to use in camping and to use in torches. Look, one of the things you asked about the size of us, there were a couple days in Texas where I think the propane industry was a bigger industry than the electric or the natural gas industry, right? When neither one of those fuels were really available and kicking. The propane industry, I think, for those couple days, were a larger industry in terms of volume and BTUs being consumed than either natural gas or electricity. Don't know that that had ever happened in the country before, but yes, I think that speaks to this versatility. We are happy to sell it to you in 1 pound cylinders for your torch, and we're happy to sell it to you in multi-million gallon capacities for your nationwide fleet.
So let me ask you about the other structure of the business, because I know that there are propane cooperatives, right? You know, there are grain cooperatives, there are electric cooperatives. I understand there are propane co-ops as well. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, so in real numbers, there are 3,000 independent dealers of propane around the country. And certainly Texas is one that has a vast network of independents. So there aren't utilities, they're not monopolies, they're independent businesses that have earned their customers' right to be a partner with their customer, either by service or, sometimes a specialization, right? Some specialize in just serving farms. Some specialize in just serving fleets. Some specialize just in serving schools for their school buses. So about 3,000 independent businesses across this country that serve small amounts or vast amounts. Some one town, 2 employees to 50 state, multi-continent propane providers. We run the gamut.
Who's the biggest player in the propane business, in the retail propane business?
In the United States, it's AmeriGas. And AmeriGas actually is quite huge in Europe as well. I mean, a multinational player. We have a couple other, a lot of people might recognize that Blue Rhino brand that, from where they use 20-pound cylinders. That's owned by a company called Ferrellgas, again, number 2 market share. But it's really interesting. 1, 2, and 3, the number 1, 2, and 3 companies have about 40% market share. The next 60 or 70 have another 25 or 30%. So you can see we have several very large companies, and we have a lot of really small companies. The one thing that's unique to us, I think, is unlike your natural gas utility or unlike your electric utility, we're generally in your town, right? We might go to church or school or play on the same baseball team as your kids. We're generally in your town, and we're generally regarded as kind of that small town local player that provides you your energy needs.
Sure. So is consumption rising? Is it falling? I don't know any of these numbers in terms of what I know. Electricity demand in the U.S. has been flat for 15 years. Oil demand, a lot of people think it's peaked. Is propane consumption rising, falling? What's happening with overall
Well,
use?
fortunately, it's certainly not falling. It's been flat to rising 2 to 3%. So almost statistically not significant. It's been pretty flat. But what we are seeing over the last couple years is we're now seeing kind of that next wave of innovation. That's really one of the things that I lead. Is we really are concerned about 3 things, right? Safety and training. Is our industry prepared to deliver the product safely? Are customers prepared to use the fuel safely? And we really have a huge effort in that. We do a little bit of work around marketing, but I think really the real investment for me has been in innovation. And we don't ever stop. These new generators that we talk about, ships that are using propane today, school buses, lawnmowers, this next generation of equipment. And so we're growing. And I think what I'm beginning to see now is that the concerns around climate and health and cost and resilience. And by the way, energy security, that's the other part here. We're talking about a US fuel, right? We're talking about a fuel that we really control huge amounts. Those are kind of combining now at a time to really give us a resurgence of demand. And just through the pandemic, we've seen a big pickup in use of propane. I mean, we talked about these small uses like patio heaters and outdoor living and that kind of thing. But now with your Winter Storm Uri and that focus on resilience, all of a sudden people are really paying attention to, are there multiple fuels that I can use? Certainly I need electricity, certainly, but I need something beyond electricity to help me so I have a resilient home. And we're seeing all of that come together, even with this view towards climate and health, to grow our industry.
It's interesting you say that about the reliability issue, because I was on a call, this is some time ago, and I mentioned the issue of affordability, and the response that I got was, well, if you don't have reliable electricity, your affordability goes down the drain. That they go hand in hand, that reliability and affordability are two sides of the same coin. So that if you don't have reliable electricity, you don't have you're going to spend more, that is, get a generator. Or even locally here in Austin, I've heard guys saying, well, now since the blackouts, we've had a huge increase in people wanting both solar and batteries. Yes. Because that's going to give them their resilience. But it's a tacit recognition that as the reliability falls, the affordability problem gets worse, and people are Yes. going to invest whatever it is that they have to. I mean, if they have the money, right, to make sure that they have reliability. So that would include a generator, a propane generator, natural gas generator, your solar and battery, something else to counteract this apparent decline, and in some cases obvious decline, in the reliability of the electric grid, which takes me back to your idea of this 3D grid. So it's just interesting. I'm riffing on this now, but it's
well, and you didn't even mention one thing. As I think about, again, as I said, I really think about all forms of energy. And yes, I work for the Propane Council, but also I just tend to labor into this issue of energy and investment in the future. It's kind of what I do, right? And I work for the natural gas and propane industry because I believe in it. But to be honest, if I didn't believe in it, I'd go somewhere else. And what I see that no one talks about, again, is how does renewable energy really continue to improve? How does that impact cost? How does that impact reliability? And you mentioned the litany of things, and you didn't even talk about cybersecurity, cyber threat. I feel like really when the cost of cybersecurity and vulnerability has really begun to be baked in to the grid, there's only one way costs can go, right? We got to make the grid smarter, costs go up. We got to make the grid able to receive renewable energy, costs are going to go up. We need to make the grid more or less vulnerable to cyber threat, cybersecurity, costs are going to go up. I mean, there's only one way electrical cost can go, I think, and that's higher. And again,
so let me interrupt you, because I think that I certainly agree, and we see that trend particularly in California, and I think we're going to see it now in Texas as these measures are passed to require resilience and reliability. But you talked earlier about this electrify everything push, and I wrote a piece during the blackout when we were blacked out, and I posted it on Forbes pointing out the perils of this move or this push. But the point that I'm getting to is that the ardent climate activists are saying, well, we need to quit burning things. They're saying we need to give up combustion, and that is that we should essentially have a solid state society, which I've not seen that somewhere else, but that we will give up combustion. Is that realistic?
No, it's not. And again, I think we all wish for that same utopia, right? We all wish for a cleaner climate, a healthier, I wish for a lot of things, and I think that is the core issue to me, where this common theme is so erroneous, right? By that fossil fuels are evil, and therefore we must eliminate them to get to a cleaner climate. The thing that strikes me,
that's what we've heard over and over from
that is the narrative,
some of the
right?
highest profile climate activists in America.
And here I'm telling you something that I don't understand why a lot of people aren't saying. By using natural gas and propane, the more you use today, the faster you get to decarbonization, the faster the climate gets cleaner. And you talk about some of the data. I've just spent the last month studying the International Energy Agency data, right? And the thing that strikes me, all of the promises of the Paris Accord and every other accord before about how we're going to reduce greenhouse gases, it's not materialized, right? And so I don't know when people are going to say that, hey, is there another way to do it, right? I think, look, we both see it. Human nature is a big part of this equation. And I think the one thing that I think a lot of the climate hawks talk about, until we take away your ability to have things like natural gas or propane, you're going to continue to use it. Yes, I think we are, right? It's because it's cheaper. It's because it's available. It does things that we like. And this conversation has become, I want to stay in the conversation about clean climate, right? I'm not the least bit, but the statement that I'll make that is completely counterintuitive to so many people, the more natural gas and propane I can use today, the faster I get to decarbonization.
And why is that? You've made that statement a couple of times. Why? Show me why that happens.
Because the grid today isn't that clean in any of the states. And I think
so you're talking specifically about substitution for coal.
Correct. Well, no, substitution for electricity. It's not just about copious amounts of coal used. It's about copious amounts of oil used when we need more kilowatts than our current generator. I mean, have you gone back and seen just how much bunker fuel was burned in this last coal round? Because when utilities don't have the watts available to them from the clean sources, so they just go down the list. And coal is but one of those things that's used. It's also about oil. It's about a lot of things that aren't good for the environment.
Oil used in standby generators. So diesel fuel or number 2 fuel oil being used in reciprocating engines that are attached to generators then.
And they don't use it much, during the nice routine runs, but in those summer peaks and those winter peaks, they're using copious amounts of oil to balance the grid, right? And I think so, but I look at the grid regularly by state, by region, and nationally. And the thing that strikes me is that today, propane and natural gas are cleaner than the grid is today. So
if I just to interrupt, so your argument is that this idea of using CH4 and C3H8
yes,
directly is a far cleaner use than converting those fuels into electricity and using them indirectly. Is that a fair?
So here's the analogy I make quite often. I took a shower this morning using a propane water heater. My propane water heater is as good as it gets. It's 97% efficient. You took a shower this morning using an electric water heater. Who was better for the environment? Most people would say, well, I use electricity. I'm pretty sure I was. If you think about the full inputs, and I'm not being, I'm not going so wild and think about just how electricity is made, transported, and used versus propane or natural gas. In almost every case, it's the same number. The answer to the question is, I was a better steward of the environment, even if the metric is just climate. I produced fewer emissions this morning with my shower than that person who used an electric water heater. Why? I used a very efficient device. I used it directly, and I consumed most of that energy into making my water hot, not into the air. And
so the conversion, your specific point is about that conversion process of, I'm in Austin, and some of the power here comes from nuclear, some comes from coal, some comes from natural gas, and some comes from wind and solar and the rest of it. But that if I'm completely reliant on nuclear, then your argument doesn't stand, right? It wouldn't work, right? Or if I'm completely solar or wind, then your point wouldn't necessarily carry here. But you're just saying that by using the hydrocarbons directly at the point of use, that's a smaller carbon footprint.
Absolutely. And in fact, there are some states that have high uses of hydroelectric power, right?
Right.
Washington State, Oregon, two
Yeah.
examples. And so there we're talking about, I want to work harmoniously with electricity. I want to do the few things we do well. I still want to heat your water. I still want to heat your home when it's cold, but that's a place where a heat pump makes perfect sense, right? So that's why I say, going back to this thing, that we're not about one fuel. One fuel never does all things well. And you can look across the world at that statement. It's true. We need to really think about how to use fuels to do the things that they do well. Certainly, I'm going to use electricity to power my television. I don't think there's any question about it, but I'm also going to use propane to heat my water, to cook my food. And if I go out tonight for my outdoor living with my family and we want to sit around a fire pit, it's not going to be wood. It's not going to be electricity. It's going to be propane.
Let me ask about that, because that was one point that was made to me, in fact, by Meredith Angwin, who I've had on the podcast a couple of times. She and I were talking about this issue of combustion, and she said, heat pumps, she said, I get the efficiency argument, but she said there is an important element of combustion, which is the radiant heat, and that is a very satisfying form of heat for us, we like cozying up to the fire. We like cozying up to, the hot oven, that radiant heat is really something that matters in terms of our overall comfort as animals, right? That's something we really respond to. And I thought that was a good point, and one that I hadn't even thought about before. But when she said it, I thought, yeah, right.
So fortunately for me, I get this broad field of view. I also have great scientists that work with me that either tell me that what I'm saying is true, or they, because again, we're about a cleaner climate. I don't want anybody to think that I'm just trying to cling. An article in the Guardian once talked about fossil fuel people just clinging to their past. Could not be further from the truth. It offended me then. It offends me now. I am as good for the climate. I'm as interested in a healthy society as anybody on this planet. Heat pumps. Often people say, well, heat pumps, that's a great device to heat your home for the environment. It works lovely in most places, right? Particularly in the Southeast. We don't get cold nights. The coefficient of performance of a heat pump is, yes, 2.5, 250%, until it gets cold. And then when it gets cold, that coefficient of performance falls off to where, it's essentially a toaster oven. Do you want to heat your home with a toaster oven? So you're talking about comfort, and I actually have a heat pump with a gas backup. It's the great way to do it. My wife and I tend to be very cold in our home when it's 55 or 60 degrees. When it gets to be 30 degrees and my gas backup comes on, we are just as comfortable as we could be in our home. So, and we've known that for years. So now you just crossed two things, right? What's good for me because of my personal comfort? What's an appliance that's good for me and my community in terms of the climate? And then what can I afford? And I think heat pump is a good example. When I talk to builders through the Southeast, unless they're in the mountains of the Appalachian Mountains or in some cold parts, I'll say certainly a heat pump, gas backup, that's good for you. That's good for the environment. For the government to suggest that a heat pump is the right device to have in Maine or Minnesota or Wisconsin, it's foolish talk right now. And I don't even know why they would do it. Homeowner would never be comfortable. The environment is not beneficial. Once again, you're relying on one energy source, a wire coming to your home. That's not this broader path. This three-dimensional grid comes right back to play, right?
And I think that's an important point, because that's one of the in fact, the city of Denver now is pushing an all electrified building code. And, it gets cold in Denver, but yeah, heat pumps, it's clear. And there have been numerous studies have found this, that when it gets below freezing and really even, near zero, the heat pump efficiency goes down the drain. And that
you'll hear me say over and over
resistance heating.
And again, we get to this point, we've been a niche fuel. We're not trying to do all things to all people. We want to do the 4 or 5 things we do really well, right?
Sure.
We want to leave to electricity those 4 or 5 things that it does really well. And by the way, you and I haven't even talked about where does electricity go in the next decade or two. And because so often people go, you're right, Tucker, that the grid today isn't the grid that I believe will be the grid of the future. And I say, I completely agree, right? I have my own podcast. I interview people around the world. I'm active in this topic worldwide. And, I see where the grid has evolved in Germany and these other things. What people completely fail to acknowledge, though, is where do these clean other fuels go, right? We're going to bring an engine out here soon into the public that its greenhouse gas output is 25% less than the next best technology today.
Is there? Well,
I won't. I'm not going to. It's a name everyone knows. It's an engine that's quite public, but as diesel has become more and more under attack, and perhaps for the right reasons in terms of its cleanliness, manufacturers have had to think about other fuels. And we talk about batteries, we talk about hydrogen. You'll begin to see propane figure right into that conversation because it's energy dense, it's clean. But again, the point is people don't even think about the innovation that we're seeing on our side for engines, for power generation.
Sure. So
I just talked about
so it's a different type of reciprocating engine, like a standard reciprocating engine with some other special sauce on it.
You know what? Yeah, I'll tell you what is interesting. And as a person who's been in this space again for 2 decades, it's the marriage of 3 things. And none of it is so sexy or secret, but all of a sudden we're marrying modern engineering with modern manufacturing and just seeing how design could be improved and improved and improved. And we're doing things that have never before been done.
And we're going to see that. So this is something that the Propane Council is going to be announcing, or is it an independent manufacturer? Or?
Well, both. But both. And by the way, you won't see it from just one manufacturer and one product. I mean, I already talked about ships. We're powering ships worldwide today, and I was involved in that a decade ago. I said it wouldn't happen. Many of those manufacturers say all of the ships we make for the next 5-6 years will be propane fuel.
Interesting.
I talk about school buses. I'm talking about backup power. You see me keep talking about prime power. The power from the Virgin Islands produced by propane. The power for most of the Caribbean islands are being produced today by propane. There's a steady.
I didn't realize that. I thought they were running on diesel fuel or fuel oil.
They used to, right? But they needed to find cheaper, cleaner, more reliable ways to do it. And really, when you get to it, there are only 2 ways to do it reliably, right? Either use natural gas or use propane.
Gotcha.
And so it's a great evolution.
Sure. So Tucker, my guest, by the way, for all of you listening, is Tucker Perkins. He's the CEO of the Propane Education and Research Council. He's the first association person we've had on the podcast. You can find more about him on propane.com. So Tucker, we're about an hour in here. I'm going to just ask you a couple last things. So what are you reading? I'd like to ask people what's on their bookshelf. What books are you reading these days?
Well, it's funny, the book that I look up right now, I mean, I read a lot of things and I love reading about innovation and design, but right now I'm just getting through the New Map, which was Daniel Yergin's book about how energy is being used. That's kind of what's on my bookshelf right this minute.
Yeah, I had him on the podcast last year. So yeah, the section he had on the 9-dash map, I thought was really one of the best parts of the book. Really interesting look at the South China Sea and the controversy around there. So last thing, Tucker, what gives you hope?
Well, I think what does give me hope, and so again, I approach this, I guess, from the start as an engineer. What gives me hope is that we are going to a real change. We're really going to see a real change in how we use energy, how we make energy, how we consume energy, right? I love to talk about conservation. Nobody ever talks about conservation, but can we be more efficient in how we use it? Could we plan our trips better? I mean, I think all of these things, the pandemic has shown us one thing. Staying at home may not always be a bad thing. Driving a few miles less might not always be a bad thing. And if we do it right, the sky's clear, our neighborhood's quieter, we get to spend a little bit more time with our family. I think what does give me hope, though, is to see how now marrying engineering with production and manufacturing gives us opportunities to really innovate in ways that we never could before see. And that we'll get to this world where we have a three-dimensional energy grid, right? We'll acknowledge the role of renewables for sun and wind particularly. We'll even see new entrants, better batteries, use of hydrogen perhaps, but we won't ignore this vast network we have of underground pipes, bought, paid for, out of sight, out of mind. And we'll bring, the issues of energy security, resilience, cost, justice, and we'll marry that to clean climate and health. That gives me great hope that we're moving in the right direction.
Well, that's a good summary of what we've been talking about. So I'll end it there. Thanks, Tucker Perkins, for the time. If you want to learn more about the Propane Education and Research Council, go to propane.com. Tucker, thanks a million for being on the Power Hungry podcast.
Robert, love this. Love Power Hungry. Thanks for the time.
Okay. Thanks to all you listening. Tune in next time for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. See you then.